As a release date for Warhammer The Old World gets ever closer and more exciting new miniatures are revealed to us, I've been beavering away in the background trying to get a substantial amount of Bretonnians and Tomb Kings ready for release whenever that happens to be. I've managed to gather quite a substantial amount of basic troops, so it's time to get them all painted, and I've been doing that in existing videos that you may have already seen. Welcome to Miniature Realms, my name's Stuart, and in this video I will show you how I paint the Tomb King's Chariot. Like I nearly always do with current projects, and especially ones for this army, I started with a black prime and then a top-down, almost zenithal white, but I do cover quite a bit more of the miniature to be officially zenithal, and a few people have asked me about that and clarified it, and I think it's important to say what I'm really doing is underpainting here, because I'm doing far more than zenithal, which would be light from a single source. I am turning the miniature around, making sure I get the sides as well, but I am trying to maintain some of that black underneath to help with some shadow. And though it's hard to see on camera under these lights, what I like to do as well is dry brush the miniatures with a further coat of white. This really picks out the details, and when you apply glaze style base coats, which I'm going to be doing with Army Painter speed paints and Citadel Contrast and Vallejo Express Colour, it really helps build that base layer, giving you either an outline for which to highlight over in the end, or leave you not needing to highlight at all. So I'm going to start off with the bones. I'm going to be using Contrast Skeleton Horde and thinning it with some medium, almost 50-50. Applying this fairly liberally over the whole miniature and just really allowing it to seep into all the crevices and just be slightly lighter on the top areas. Next up, I'm reaching for Caribbean Turquoise from Vallejo Express Colour. It's one of the two spot colours I'm using in my army, and it's really vibrant and really makes the miniatures stand out. And if you've seen the existing tutorials already on the channel for my Tomb Kings, you'll have a good idea of how I'm going to use this. The aim for this army is very much a quick tabletop job, but also to be fairly striking as well. I'm not spending quite as much time on this as I am on my Bretonnians, and I really wanted to get something that was able to do relatively quickly to get a certain amount of points, however much they are in the new game, around the 2,000 mark in old money. Get it on the table looking pretty nice, but not spend a ridiculous amount of time doing it. Most of these miniatures are also eBay rescues or second hand, so I haven't built them. I've gone back in and tidied them up as much as possible. Tried to remove all of the mold lines even though they've been built already and it's hard to get to certain places. And while I'm painting, I do find more still, which is quite frustrating. But once all painted en masse, should still look pretty cool on the table. Next up, I'm giving the bones a little dry brush of off-white, in this case from Model Colour, but you can use any white that you have. This is a very thin layer. I'm not trying to cover over the paint I've done with the Skeleton Horde, really just picking up on the edges and just making it pop a little bit more. So nearly all stages is exactly the same method on the Chariot crew. Now it's the turn of Contrast Blood Angels Red, which is the second spot colour on the army. And in this case, I'm going to use it to paint these holders of the spears and the large bow that's stored on the back of the chariot. There's less place to add it to the crew, but there's a perfect little area as this little bit of fabric that's tied onto the back of a spear. Now on to the trusty Garagax Zua, which is one of my favourite go-tos for wood and for leather. I'm going to be using this for the base layer of all the wood on the chariot itself. So in the inside here, this is just going to be straight contrast. Their feet are going to be stuck down. I'm going to add some pigment later to add some texture. So I want to make sure that this is a nice even coat which soaks into the wood grain but does show the wood grain. I don't want to go too hard. So next up, using the same colour on the wheels, again just making sure that the coat is fairly smooth, letting the contrast paint do its stuff and stick in the recesses a little bit more than it does on the flat areas. Finishing off with the chariot's harness, or whatever happens to be called itself, working my way up. There will be some areas that I paint over in gold here, which is the metallic colour for the army, but I'm not too worried about painting gold over this brown. In fact, the brown gives quite a nice base layer as and when it's needed. Sticking with the same colour, I'm using it on the spear shafts as well. And that includes the one that's being held by the crew member. And while the pot was open, I used it for the handle of the whip. Now to break up the browns a little, I'm using hardened leather from Army Painter Speed Paint, and I'm using this for the bow, but also for all the leather areas of the skeleton's armour, and this is the same throughout the army. Army Painter Speed Paints flow really well. They're a little bit thinner than contrast paint, so while you need a little bit more control when you're using them in small areas like this, you get a much smoother coat and a nice natural highlight where it moves away from the highest areas, meaning it's very easy to highlight afterwards. You've got a very nice area just to aim for, and in many cases you don't need to highlight at all. Now to Black Lotus from Vallejo Express Colour. I've been using this in the army for all wrappings and fabric areas. So that's the bandages on some of the skeletons, but also on this wrapping around the handle of the bow itself, and also that little bit of fabric at the top end where the string would be tied. There's some wrappings around the top areas of the chariot here where the quivers for those bows and the big spears are being held. And now for the previously mentioned bandages on these skeletons, and this paint is again very much like the hardened leather from Army Painter in that it really flows nicely across the miniature, sticking in the recesses but giving you this nice natural highlight. Some contrast paints do that very well, but some need to be thinned a little bit more to do that, but the Express Colour and the Army Painter Speed Paints seem to do that a little bit more consistently out of the pot. That's not saying that they're better than contrast paints. Contrast paints are probably a little bit easier to use overall, and you can get that effect often by thinning, but these paints tend to do that naturally, which is very, very handy in certain instances like this. Now on to my trusty favourite gold from Scale Colour or Scale 75. This is Necro Gold, and this is the base layer for all the gold on this chariot and the army overall. Just working my way around, there's lots of metallic areas on the chariot. I'm using this gold for all of them apart from the sharp pointy bits. On the crew themselves, just like any of the infantry you've seen in previous tutorials, have lots of little embossed skulls and little studs and things, and I've made them gold throughout the army, and some of the leather areas have metal rims to them as well, which I also edge with the same gold. For those sharp pointy bits, sticking with Scale Colour, Scale 75, this is black metal, just a really, really nice solid base layer for any metallic. Also used it on the rims of the wheels. Not forgetting the big sharp spike on the front of the chariot, or the slightly smaller spike on this spear. Next up I reach for Contrast Black Legion. I'm going to be using that in two places. First up as the base layer for the leather whip, but also for this crumbling ruins on the base. Now for Citadel Evil Sun Scarlet, and this is a really nice complement to the Blood Angels Contrast Red. Tends to highlight very, very nicely on top of it. So I'm working from a bit of an edge highlight and then feathering down and blending down about a third of the way onto the quiver themselves. If you are enjoying the video, and maybe you've watched previous videos and made use of them before and found them helpful, I have started a Patreon for those of you who feel able or would like to support the channel. Absolutely no obligation. I will be continuing to make these videos as I love doing them, but any help would be greatly appreciated. I've also started a Discord as well, and while some of the channels on the Discord are Patreon only, there are some free, completely open ones as well, where you can chat basically about the videos, share some of your work and things, which would be really, really nice. The amount of times I've had chats with people in the comments talking about what they've been doing, but been unable to see what they've been doing because they've got nowhere they could share them so I could see them, which would be fantastic. So head over, check out the show description. There's a link to the Patreon and the link to the Discord as well. To add some extra pop to that red, you can also do a fine edge highlight of Wild Rider Red. It just really makes it stand out. Don't forget to highlight any spot colours you may have on the crew as well. Scale 75 do a lovely Caribbean blue, which is a perfect highlight for the Caribbean turquoise express colour. And what I'm doing here is just adding some edge highlights. This is a slightly different shade of paint in some ways, so if you go too heavy with it, you'll need to do a lot of feathering and blending, but you can get quite a nice striking effect just by doing some edge highlights, as I'm doing here around this bit of material that's on the tops of the quivers. And then just adding some very thin line highlights around the edges of these panels really just helps it stand out and pop a little. Down the bottom you can be a little bit thicker and blend it out a little bit, and if it looks too heavy at any stage you can always glaze it back with a little bit more of the express colour Caribbean turquoise. And just like with the red, don't forget to go back to your crew members and do some similar highlights on any areas of those spot colours you have there. So in this guy, it's a little tabard, and I'm just doing some faint edge highlights and picking out a couple of the little sort of scratches or indentations on the tabard itself. Model colour from Vallejo has some fantastic brown ranges, and their flat earth and tan earth colours are really great for highlighting wood areas or really highlighting anything over the base of Garragax sewer. So we start with the flat earth. I'm just doing some thin lines, partly following the detail on the miniature. There are some very faint sort of wood shaped marks which have been accentuated by the way that the contrast paint runs into the recesses. Though if you wanted to do a slightly quicker job on this, and by all means I am not doing a very neat job, I'm just doing some lines, but if you wanted to do a quicker job you could just do some more flat style highlights on the top and then sort of layer up afterwards. Continuing the same method over onto the wheels, just doing some lines out towards where the wood gets thinner just to keep the shape. Running the brush around the edges of the wheels just to accentuate that edge that's most visible. Continuing those lines on the other wooden areas of the chariot, so we have the harness here as well. And then moving on to the lighter tan earth for a thinner line on the spokes of the wheels, and then just going back to the same area, so slightly thinner lines on the wood grain, around the edges of the wheels, and so on and so on. And as I've already mentioned, you can very much leave this off. This is a tabletop standard tutorial. These little touches just make it look a little bit more like a nicer, higher end tabletop than a very basic, but using contrast paints the way we have, it will still look pretty cool. And again, don't forget the wooden areas on the crew. Now for some model colour, light brown from Vallejo, and I'm going to use this to highlight just the top half of this big large bow here. It's a perfect edge accompaniment or edge highlight for the hardened leather and the way that goes over the pre-highlighted surface, and you really just find using the edge of your brush here just to accentuate the lighter colour that's at the top of that bow and a little bit in the flat centre, and it just does a perfect job. Super simple. And once again, don't forget to highlight the crew with the same colour. This time it's their leather areas, and if you've watched the previous tutorials for Tomb Kings, you'll have seen me doing this there. I'm just accentuating the very edges of the leather areas, and this paint is just perfect for it, just to make it stand out and pop a little bit more. Back to some scale colour, some scale 75, and this is Bering Blue. I'm just using a single coat of this just to accentuate those wraps in the larger areas. So on the sides of the chariot here, just going back over those higher areas which have already looked lighter due to the way the Black Lotus paint has gone into the recesses there. It just makes them pop a little bit more. I'm picking out some of the edges of the bandages on the crew here. Now, a lot of the rank and file troops, which these are really, I suppose, I've not been doing this because the Black Lotus does a pretty good job of it. Having painted all the rest of it, it's not really very noticeable, and it's all about time saving when you're army painting. But as these are crew on a chariot, I thought while the paint was out, I would just pick out the odd little part and reinforce it a little. Now we start moving towards highlighting the metallics, and this is Elven Gold from Scale Colour, and this is a perfect next highlight to the Necro Gold, and I'm just working on to the higher areas here where the light would shine and just adding it in as some edge, some area highlights, and it just goes on very nicely and really makes it pop. Keep working your way around all of the miniatures, making sure you're leaving some of the darker Necro Gold showing through. It's not always the easiest to see on camera with it being quite reflective. There's quite a lot of gold on the miniatures, so it's worth taking your time. I did a little bit of feathering and blending out on some of the larger, flatter areas, so we didn't have too much harsh of a line. And you've also got lots of other little details as well, like the rivets and the skull emblems. Of course, you have the crew as well, and you've got all the little gold areas, and I won't linger on this too much, but you've got lots of the same thing with rivets and bolts and emblems and things. They've got areas of gold armour, so I'm just again highlighting as you would anything else, picking out the higher areas where the sun would reflect from. It just really makes it start to pop. Now, to add a little bit of recessed shade to that gold, I'm using Cryptek Armor Shade Gloss, and this is heavily thin. This is fully 50-50 with water, and I'm just pin washing it here into the darkest recesses. You could do this stage before you do the final highlight. Sometimes I do. On these larger areas of gold like this, I like to do it afterwards and then reinforce any areas I need to with the top highlight. This kind of gives me a little bit more of an idea of how much I need to blend the shade down, but there's no right or wrong way. Do whichever way you feel most comfortable with. I find it easier just to focus on the eye sockets and the lower parts of the skull emblems and things like that. You're really not trying to cover the whole thing as you would do with a wash, otherwise you will dull it all a bit too much. And of course, but being a little bit more careful, you do have the golden areas on the crew themselves, and you can always touch it up afterwards with just a little dot here or there of the elven gold just to make it pop again if you think you've dulled it too much. Now I want to do a really quick highlight on that whip, so I'm starting with a dry brush of model colour German grey, which is a very dull grey on the graphite-y black spectrum side of things. Finishing off with a highlight dry brush of London grey on top, which is just that ever so slightly lighter, just picking the areas where the light would catch most, and by dry brushing it very, very gentle like that, you get this nice sort of blend effect between the two. Extremely close to the end now, so we have some Game Air silver, and again I'm dry brushing, and I'm dry brushing onto all the sharp pointy bits. So we have the spear ends, the large ones on the chariot itself, the smaller spears held by the crew, the wheels, and then I'm adding just a little bit of non-oil to the bottom parts of some of the spears just to make sure that you don't lose that shadow effect. Now it's time to start basing, so we got AK Terrain's Desert Stand here, and this is my go-to at the moment for anything desert. I'm just applying it to the whole of the base. Once that's fully dry, I'm going to make my own wash from Contrast Skeleton Horde, and I'm thinning this almost 50-50 with water. Now you can do this on a palette, but you can also do this just by putting a dollop of Skeleton Horde down and then dipping your paint into some clean water and just blending it out. It doesn't matter if there's slight variations on the base itself where it's darker in one area to the other. That would naturally happen anyway around where the wheels are providing shadow, etc, etc, but just make sure it doesn't go on too dark, otherwise the next stage doesn't blend in quite the way you'd like it to. And that next stage is dried pigments, and we have light sienna, we have dark yellow ochre, and then we have green earth, which is almost a white colour. I'm just brushing these dry directly into the base, and what I'm trying to do here is to build up multiple tones and really make it look like sand rather than basing texture. And when you blow the excess away, it stays. You don't need to worry about it. Now you don't want to get it wet, but if you do seal the miniature after this, you will hide a lot of the work there, so you make your choice on that. I know some people are nervous about putting dry pigment on a miniature like that, but when you brush it into something textured, it really stays in there, honestly. So the mixture of the three areas means that you get a sort of a multi-layered, multi-textural effect on the base of the different colours. It really just tricks the eye into believing that there's lots going on there, when really it's just three different colours of powder onto some sandy, painty mixture, but it looks pretty cool. I'm also making sure I'm brushing it all around the reels, around the broken bits of ruins themselves, and onto the sides of the chariot itself. It just makes it really look like it's in its environment rather than gliding along on the top of it. Now on to some finishing touches here, and I'm just using some 2mm tufts. I've got two types here. They're both kind of a wasteland brown kind of effect. One just plain, and the other has bleached top, so almost your Shane Warne of 2mm tufts. A final touch around the base rim of black, and we are done. There we have it, one tabletop Tomb King's Chariot. It's pretty basic all the way through. If you really break back the stages, there's nothing too taxing there. If you leave off the few areas of edge highlighting, there are no advanced techniques at all. Very much something you can achieve quite easily at home with contrast paints and a bit of dry brushing. If you don't have an airbrush, you can very much use a grey primer and maybe do a white dry brush on top and get very, very similar effects. I'm really enjoying painting these Tomb Kings. You can get some quite striking or eye-catching effects with some fairly basic techniques, and they stand out really, really nicely on the tabletop. Some miniatures you paint and you work really, really hard on them, and they just don't stand out the way you'd like them to. But these Tomb Kings miniatures, as old as they are, seem to take paint quite well, and very basic techniques do stand up and give you a nice looking army. We're here getting towards the end of November 2023. I'm looking at the calendar and wondering when next year the old world will be released, and I'm thinking, how long have I got to get all these painted? And so ideally I'd really love to get a small force finish for these, or at least a good amount of core, and for the Bretonians as well, so when the new miniatures arrive I can start adding all the nice big beasties and special characters and things next year. I'd love to hear what you're working on, so please let me know in the comments. Are you working on Tomb Kings as well, or other armies for the old world? And if you'd like to chat about it in a bit more detail, please do head over to the link and join the Discord. It would be lovely to see more and more people join over there. And as I mentioned earlier, I have launched a Patreon for those of you who would like to support the channel further. I'd be greatly appreciative of any help there. But most of all, I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please give us a like if you've liked the video and enjoyed it, because it definitely helps other people get to see it. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.